A racist police officer openly insulted and shoved a black woman in the police station parking lot, simply because he believed she didn't belong there. But when she pulled out a badge that gleamed under the lights, he froze in shock. His rash action triggered a thorough investigation, leading to unavoidable consequences that shook an entire rotten system to its core. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more shocking and unmissable stories with us. The skies over Eastbridge had just cleared after rain, leaving the police station parking lot bathed in flickering yellow lights and puddles reflecting the mottled pavement. The air was thick with the damp smell of wet concrete and car oil. Sandra Taylor, the city's first black police chief, stood beside her unmarked car. She was dressed in plain clothes, a dark jacket, and simple leather shoes, with nothing to suggest she was the head of the police department. Jake Miller, a veteran officer with 15 years of experience, entered the parking lot, weary after a long shift. His eyes quickly landed on Sandra, whom he didn't recognize. Jake took a deep breath, his chest puffing out, already picturing a potential intruder. "Hey, you?" His voice cut through the quiet, cold, and commanding. Sandra turned calmly, keeping her composure. "Yes?" "You're not allowed to be here," Jake said, his tone sharp. "This area is restricted." Sandra raised an eyebrow slightly, her gaze sweeping over Jake, instantly recognizing him as one of her subordinates. "I work here," she replied evenly, her hand resting on the car door. But Jake wasn't listening. His eyes scrutinized her, from her plain attire to her skin color. He quickly concluded, she didn't belong there. "Don't play games with me," he said, taking a step closer. "Step away from the car, or I'll have to use force." Sandra remained calm. "You're making a big mistake, Officer Miller." Jake ignored the warning. "People like you don't belong here," he snarled, his gaze icy. Sandra straightened her posture, her eyes lighting up. That phrase, "people like you," wasn't new to her, but it cut deep every time. "What did you just say?" Her voice was low, but each word was razor-sharp. Jake scoffed, confident in his authority. "I said you don't belong here. Leave before I call for backup." Sandra didn't respond. Slowly, she removed her hand from the car door and reached into her jacket pocket. The movement made Jake tense, his hand hovering over his holstered gun. But instead of a weapon, Sandra pulled out a badge that glinted brightly under the lights. The police chief's badge. Jake froze. The blood drained from his face. "You're—" Sandra stepped closer, her voice sharper than the chilly night air. "I'm Chief Sandra Taylor, and you've just made a very serious mistake." Jake took a step back, his earlier confidence evaporating. At that moment, he was no longer the authoritative officer but a man caught in a compromising position. Sandra held his gaze. Her silence speaks volumes about power, responsibility, and the shame Jake would bear for his actions. This incident set the stage for a confrontation, not just between Sandra and Jake, but between an outdated culture and the values of justice and equality Sandra represented. This wasn't just a clash. It was the spark that ignited a chain of events, shaking the entire Eastbridge police system to its foundations. The silence in the parking lot froze in place the moment Sandra Taylor revealed her badge. Jake Miller stood there, his eyes vacant, the sense of authority he once trusted now feeling more fragile than ever. But what had led to the arrogance and deep-seated prejudice in Jake? Jake grew up in a small town in the southern United States where conservative values were deeply embedded in the culture and community. His family, particularly his father, a war veteran, constantly emphasized that the world was divided into us and them, As a child, Jake often sat listening to his father recount war stories, always interwoven with lessons that only the strong deserved respect. Police officers, in Jake's father's eyes, were enforcers of order through strength, not empathy. If you don't make them fear you, you'll lose control, his father would say whenever Jake questioned his harshness. These values followed Jake into adulthood, shaping his belief that power was not just a tool, but an end goal. When he joined the police force, Jake quickly stood out for his ability to impose order. But beneath that confidence lay a distorted belief. His job wasn't to protect the community, but to control it. Jake's career started promisingly. He quickly found a mentor in Deputy Chief Robert Haynes. Robert, an experienced man with a polished demeanor and piercing gaze, embodied the old system that had shielded people like Jake for generations. Robert saw in Jake the perfect tool, loyal, easy to control, and imbued with the ideology Robert wanted to preserve. In Robert's eyes, Sandra Taylor was the greatest threat. Her appointment as police chief disrupted the order he had built and protected. "You need to be tougher, Jake," Robert would say during private meetings. "We can't let someone like her mess everything up." Robert's words not only reinforced Jake's prejudices, but also encouraged increasingly extreme behavior. From ignoring Sandra's orders to deliberately creating obstacles for new minority officers, Jake became a tool for Robert to maintain his grip on power. However, Sandra's arrival brought new energy to the police department. She didn't just introduce modern thinking, but also pushed for changes that Robert and Jake viewed as a threat. To Sandra, power wasn't about control, it was about service. This left Jake feeling uneasy, as everything he had believed was now being challenged. Sensing Jake's insecurity, Robert manipulated him even further. "She doesn't belong here, Jake," Robert would say whenever Sandra's name came up. "If we don't squash this now, the whole system will collapse." Gradually, Jake came to see Sandra not just as an unlikable superior, but as the embodiment of everything he feared: change, vulnerability, and a loss of control. The story gradually reveals the larger picture of Jake, a product of a conservative system, nurtured by prejudice and manipulated by those in power. The confrontation between Sandra and Jake was not just a personal conflict, but a manifestation of a larger battle between change and outdated values, between justice and the abuse of power. Sandra Taylor left the parking lot that night with a cold determination. She knew Jake Miller's actions were not just a personal insult, but a symptom of a larger issue, a rotten system that had shielded abusers of power for years. The very next morning, Sandra began gathering records on Jake. She reviewed old reports, scrutinized community complaints, and cross-referenced data with personnel files. What she found didn't surprise her, but it still sent a chill down her spine. Jake had a long history of misconduct, with numerous complaints ignored or swiftly shelved without investigation. Some cases bore clear signs of cover-ups, altered reports and witness statements disregarded. All trails lead to a familiar name: Deputy Chief Robert Haynes. The records Sandra reviewed shared one common thread. Robert had either signed off on or intervened to ensure that Jake and other officers like him never faced real consequences. One report in particular made Sandra pause. It detailed a violent arrest Jake had conducted 3 years prior. The arrestee, a young black man, had filed a complaint alleging excessive and unjustified use of force. But, as Sandra read the conclusion, everything became clear. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, with Robert Haynes' signature appearing prominently on the final decision. When Sandra officially launched an internal investigation, The atmosphere within the police department grew tense. Some officers, particularly those closely allied with Robert, began expressing their discontent in subtle ways. They didn't confront Sandra directly, but their resistance manifested in small yet unmistakable actions: delays in submitting reports, deliberate mishandling of information, and whispered, ambiguous conversations in the hallways. One day, as Sandra passed by the conference room, she noticed a group of officers gathered. They fell silent when she entered, their eyes full of defiance. Among them, Sandra recognized several names from the list of individuals linked to Jake's covered-up incidents. Darren Wilson, a neutral officer and one of the few people Sandra could trust, came into her office that afternoon. "Sandra," he said, his voice low but serious, "they're saying you launched this investigation to take Jake down. Some of them even see you as the enemy." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "I don't care what they think, Darren. I just want the truth." "Robert Haynes isn't someone to take lightly," Darren added. "You know he won't let this go." Sandra nodded. She knew. Robert had already begun rallying his allies to protect not just Jake, but also the system that had upheld their power for years. The tension within the department became increasingly palpable. One morning, Sandra received an anonymous email. The subject line made her frown. "Be careful who you're up against." The content of the email was simple but threatening. "Don't think you can change everything. You're not strong enough alone. Back off before it's too late." Sandra understood this wasn't just a warning. It was proof that the forces behind Jake were starting to push back. Sandra's investigation was no longer limited to Jake. It began to uncover key links in the corrupt system Robert Haynes had safeguarded for so long. But with every step forward, she faced mounting resistance from within: delays, defiance, and veiled threats. The real battle had now begun. The atmosphere within the police department grew increasingly tense as the day of the hearing approached. Anonymous emails, defiant looks in the hallways, and the silence of some veteran officers all pointed to one thing. Sandra was up against a system backing Jake Miller and those like him. When she stepped into the hearing room, Sandra was prepared for a battle, not just with Jake, but with the power structure supporting him. Jake entered the hearing with a confident demeanor, though the tension in his eyes was unmistakable. Sitting beside him was Deputy Chief Robert Haynes, orchestrating the defense strategy. Robert, with his composed and sharp appearance, gave Jake a slight nod as he entered, as if to say, "Leave it to me." Robert opened the hearing with a forceful statement, indirectly targeting Sandra. "Officer Miller is a dedicated policeman with 15 years of unwavering service," Robert declared, his voice echoing through the room. These allegations, when examined closely, seemed to stem from a misunderstanding and, perhaps, a degree of personal bias from our new leadership. Following Robert's lead, Jake added, "I've worked hard to protect this community," his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "But since Chief Taylor took office, I've felt constantly scrutinized and unfairly judged. This isn't how I thought a team should function." Jake's words, though full of deflection, elicited nods of agreement from some members of the council, individuals accustomed to the old ways of the system. Sandra remained silent for most of the session, allowing Jake and Robert to reveal their full strategy. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was calm but resolute. "This isn't a personal matter," she began, her gaze sweeping across the council members. "This is about accountability. Every allegation against Officer Miller is backed by evidence, from reports and witness statements to surveillance footage." Sandra presented several documents as evidence, including internal reports highlighting a pattern of violent behavior by Jake. She emphasized that these incidents were not isolated events, but part of a recurring trend over many years. "I'm not here to target anyone personally," she said, her voice firm. "I'm here to uphold the honor of the badge we wear, to ensure that we truly serve our community rather than burden it." As the hearing progressed, the division within the council became apparent. Some members seemed sympathetic to Sandra's argument, while others, influenced by Robert, appeared hesitant. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the council reached a decision. Jake Miller would be suspended without pay for 3 months and required to attend mandatory training on communication and conflict resolution. When the decision was read, Sandra felt a heavy wave of disappointment. Suspension was not a real punishment. It was a slap on the wrist. Jake would return and the system would continue to shield him. Jake, on the other hand, maintained a composed expression as he listened to the verdict. But as he left the hearing room, he cast Sandra a faint smirk, as if to say, "What did you win?" Sandra didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him with her head held high. Yet, deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a much harder fight. The first hearing ended with a result that made Sandra realize she was confronting a deeply entrenched system, where wrongdoers were still protected by a web of connections. The council's decision wasn't just a personal setback, but a stark reminder that this battle would be far from easy. However, for Sandra, this small defeat only fueled her determination to continue exposing the truth. The council's decision in the first hearing was not the end, but a new beginning for Jake Miller and his supporters. With the backing of Deputy Chief Robert Haynes, Jake didn't simply wait out his suspension. He began devising a plan of retaliation. "So, you want to play tough, Sandra?" Jake thought bitterly, his eyes glinting with malice. "I'll show you what a real fight looks like." Jake started by reaching out to some prominent local journalists, individuals eager for controversial stories about power struggles and politics in public institutions. With Robert's help, Jake painted a completely different picture of Sandra Taylor, a tyrannical new leader, abusing her authority to target white officers like himself. The first articles began to appear on local news sites with sensational headlines. "Internal discrimination. Is Sandra Taylor overstepping her bounds?" "Racial tensions at the Eastbridge Police Department." In these articles, Jake cast himself as the victim of a purge targeting veteran officers. He cleverly wove his narrative, emphasizing that he was merely doing his duty, but had been unjustly undermined by Sandra. "She doesn't want me here," Jake said during an interview, his eyes full of feigned indignation. "This isn't about accountability or justice. This is about her reshaping everything her way, no matter the opposition." The articles quickly spread on social media, sparking a wave of divided opinions in the community. Some rallied behind Sandra, praising her for taking on a corrupt system, but many turned against her, accusing her of creating unnecessary division within the police department. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sandra noticed the growing tension. Defiant stares, whispered conversations behind her back, and outright non-cooperation from certain officers made her job increasingly difficult. But the most heartbreaking discovery was finding out that one of her most trusted allies was secretly feeding information to Robert and Jake. That person was Officer Lisa Carter, a young woman Sandra had once seen as an ally. Lisa had been present at crucial meetings, participated in the internal investigation, and consistently expressed support for Sandra. But her recent actions began to raise suspicion. One evening, Darren Wilson walked into Sandra's office, his face grim. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but serious. Sandra put down her pen, looking at him intently. "What is it, Darren?" "It's Lisa," he sighed. "She's been in contact with Robert. I've heard that she's providing him with information about the investigation." Sandra sat in stunned silence for a few moments. Lisa had been one of the few people she trusted from the start. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. Darren nodded. "I've checked. The reports she's submitted recently show signs of being tampered with, and Robert always seems to be one step ahead of us." Sandra felt as though a knife had been plunged into her back. But she didn't let her emotions deter her. She knew this betrayal was just another part of the larger battle. That evening, she summoned Lisa to her office. Lisa's eyes flickered with a brief moment of unease, but quickly regained their composure. "Lisa," Sandra began, her voice calm but cold. "Do you have something you'd like to tell me?" Lisa shook her head, trying to maintain an innocent expression. "No, Chief, nothing at all." Sandra leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me. I know you've been talking to Robert." Lisa remained silent for a moment, then lowered her head. I didn't mean to betray you," she said quietly, "but I had to protect myself. Robert promised me that if I helped him, I wouldn't get caught up in this." Sandra let out a heavy sigh, the weight of disappointment settling in her chest. "Lisa, don't you see that every time you give in, you're only making this system stronger?" Lisa didn't respond, but regret was etched clearly on her face. Jake had succeeded in using the media to erode Sandra's public image. Lisa's betrayal only exacerbated the situation, leaving Sandra to contend not only with external pressures, but also with division within her ranks. Yet, despite everything working against her, Sandra knew she couldn't give up. This wasn't just a fight for her honor, but for the change the community so desperately needed. The evening after her confrontation with Lisa Carter, Sandra Taylor sat in her office, the soft yellow light from her desk lamp illuminating the thick files piled on her desk. The pressure weighed heavily on her, with attacks coming from every side, from the media to her department. But she didn't have time to falter. Sandra knew that to turn the tide, she needed something more powerful. Undeniable evidence capable of breaking through the protective wall surrounding Robert Haynes and Jake Miller. As the clock struck midnight, the ping of an email notification echoed in Sandra's quiet office. She opened her inbox, tension building as she read the subject line: "The truth about Robert Haynes and Jake Miller." Inside the email was an attached file and a short, cryptic message. "You are not alone. Use this to expose them." Sandra immediately opened the attachment. What appeared on the screen made her eyes widen in disbelief. The documents included internal memos, email exchanges, and even altered reports used to cover up misconduct by Jake and other officers over the years. One report from 7 years ago caught her attention. It detailed an incident where Jake was accused of using excessive force during an arrest, resulting in severe injuries to a suspect. The original report, written by a subordinate officer, described the incident in full detail. However, in the final version, these details had been removed, and the case was recorded as necessary self-defense. The final, approving signature was none other than Robert Haynes. Another email from Robert to Jake, sent 3 years ago, was even more blatant. "Don't worry about the complaints. I'll handle them. Just keep doing what you're doing." Sandra meticulously read through each document, each line of text, realizing this was the evidence she needed to dismantle the protective system Robert had built. The following morning, Sandra convened a private meeting with Darren Wilson and a few neutral officers she still trusted. The stack of newly acquired documents sat prominently on the table before them. "This is our chance," Sandra said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "These documents prove that the system hasn't just covered up Jake's misconduct, but has protected an entire network of corruption within this department." Darren picked up one of the files, his expression tense as he scanned the lines. "We need to be extremely careful with this. Robert won't sit idly by once he knows we have these." Sandra nodded. "I know, but if we do nothing, everything we've worked for will mean nothing." She also knew that using this evidence wasn't just about taking down Jake and Robert. She needed to make the neutral officers, the ones hesitating, realize that staying silent was tantamount to enabling the rot within the system. In the days that followed, Sandra began meeting individually with some of these neutral officers, showing them the evidence and skillfully posing the question, "Is this the kind of police department you want to work in? Is this how we serve our community?" Gradually, attitudes began to shift. The avoidance and uneasy silence from these officers started to transform into quiet cooperation. Though they didn't openly align with Sandra, the subtle changes in their demeanor suggested they were beginning to see the truth. Sandra knew the next hearing would be her opportunity to use this evidence to dismantle Robert's defense of Jake. But she also understood that if she wasn't careful, Robert's allies would attempt to discredit the documents and undermine their value. She spent hours in her office, organizing the evidence into a cohesive narrative, building a clear case that illustrated how the system had shielded Jake and officers like him. She carefully prepared her speech, crafting each word to strike a chord with the wavering council members. The night before the hearing, Sandra sat in silence, feeling the weight of the task ahead. She knew this wasn't just about Jake Miller. It was about upholding the fairness and transparency she had promised the community when she took on this role. The anonymous documents didn't just bring Sandra hope. They marked a pivotal turning point in her battle. But she was keenly aware that with every step forward, the resistance from Robert and his allies would grow fiercer. The upcoming hearing wasn't just an opportunity to topple Jake. It would be the ultimate test of Sandra's leadership and resolve. Early the next morning, as the tension in the police station hung thick in the air, Robert Haynes held a private meeting with his supporters. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the station, Jake Miller, once confident the system would shield him, sat alone in the break room. In front of him lay a copy of the documents Sandra had recently revealed internally, damning evidence of the corruption he had been a part of. Jake flipped through the pages, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The email exchanges between him and Robert, the altered reports, and the complaints he had deliberately ignored, all stared back at him like a mirror reflecting a brutal truth. How did it come to this? Jake asked himself, his mind a whirlwind of anger, fear, and a gnawing sense of shame. He remembered his early days on the force when he had joined with the simple belief the police were there to protect the community and keep the streets safe. Over time, under Robert Haynes's influence, that belief had been twisted. "They won't respect you unless they fear you," Robert had once told him. Those words, once persuasive, now echoed in Jake's mind like a haunting warning. The night before deciding to approach Sandra, Jake witnessed something he couldn't forget. A young family leaving the police station after filing a complaint. The father clutched his wife and children, his eyes filled with helplessness as though he knew nothing would come of it. Jake felt a pang in his chest. "Is this what we're supposed to do?" he asked himself, for the first time doubting that the power he had once wielded brought real safety. Jake had always believed he was simply doing his job, and that power was the only way to maintain order. But now he realized he wasn't just a cog in the system. He was complicit. That realization weighed heavily on Jake throughout the day. As the glances of his colleagues slid past him, he no longer sensed the unspoken respect he had once taken pride in. Instead, he saw suspicion, even contempt. That evening, unable to endure it any longer, Jake waited until the station was nearly empty before heading to Sandra Taylor's office, hesitating but determined. Sandra was seated at her desk, engrossed in preparations for the next hearing, when a knock interrupted her focus. "Come in," she said without looking up. The door opened and Jake stepped in, his face lined with exhaustion. Sandra looked up, her expression briefly surprised before hardening into caution. "What do you need, Miller?" she asked, her tone firm. Jake stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, as though weighing his words. "I need to talk to you," he began, his voice low. Sandra folded her arms, maintaining her composure. "About what?" Jake took a deep breath, his eyes filled with tension. "I've read those documents. What you have, it doesn't just hurt me. It shatters the entire system I once believed in." Sandra said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I've done wrong," Jake admitted, his voice trembling. "I've done things I thought were right at the time. But now I see I was just part of the problem. And this system, it doesn't protect us. It only protects people like Robert, who drag us all down." Sandra studied him for a long moment, searching his eyes for sincerity. "So, what do you intend to do about it, Miller?" Jake lowered his gaze, as though wrestling with himself. "I've got nothing left to lose," he said slowly. "My reputation's already destroyed. But I don't want it to end like this. I want to make things right." "What do you mean?" Sandra asked, her voice steady but sharp. Jake raised his head, his eyes filled with newfound determination. "I'll help you. I'll testify. Do you want evidence? I have it. You need to know what happened in those closed-door meetings, the decisions Robert made. I know it all. If you're going to take him down, I'll help." Sandra sat still, processing his words. She had never imagined Jake, the very embodiment of everything she was fighting against, would be standing before her, offering his assistance. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "You don't have to trust me," Jake replied, his tone firmer now. "But I have no other motive. Robert won't protect me anymore, and if I don't act, I'll just be a coward all over again." Sandra stared at Jake, weighing his words. She knew working with him was a significant risk, but she also realized that Jake might be the key to dismantling the system Robert had built. "I'll give you one chance," she said, her voice steely. "But remember, Miller, if you betray me again, I won't hesitate to make you pay." Jake nodded, a faint trace of relief in his expression. "I understand." Jake's unexpected appearance in Sandra's office marked a surprising turn of events. Once an adversary, Jake now stood as an unlikely ally. But could he truly redeem himself? Or was this merely a ploy to save himself? For Sandra, it was a gamble. But she knew there was no greater risk than standing still in a corrupt system. Before Jake left Sandra's office, his phone buzzed with an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was low and threatening. "Jake, if you side with her, you won't just lose your career. We know about your family in that other town. Think carefully." Cold sweat trickled down Jake's back. It wasn't the first threat he'd received, but this one targeted his family. He left Sandra's office conflicted, torn between facing Robert or protecting his loved ones. In the days that followed, Jake wrestled with his conscience. He avoided Sandra's gaze at the station, but the image of her badge and her resolute declaration lingered in his mind. Jake realized that staying silent would only make him a pawn in Robert's game once again. Sandra knew that Jake's sudden agreement to cooperate would change the game, but she also understood that it would infuriate Deputy Chief Robert Haynes, a man who never backed down. As the leaked documents began to surface as evidence, Sandra could feel Robert's shadow creeping deeper into every corner of the police department and even her personal life. Robert, with years of experience and accumulated power, wasted no time in launching a counteroffensive. Instead of confronting Sandra directly, he chose to operate from the shadows, leveraging his extensive network to distort the truth. First, Robert began manipulating the hearing council. He arranged private meetings with certain council members, individuals he had supported and helped in the past. Through subtle persuasion, he planted the idea that Sandra's investigation was merely a personal vendetta aimed at dismantling the system, sowing doubt about her motives. "She doesn't understand how things work here," Robert told a council member during a private meeting. "If we let her continue, she'll destroy this entire police department." By portraying himself as a keeper of order, Robert not only defended his position, but also weakened his support for Sandra. Some council members began questioning her true objectives, while others hesitated to openly back her as they had before. When manipulating the council wasn't enough to halt the investigation, Robert turned to a more insidious tactic, targeting Sandra's personal life. One morning, while Sandra was working, her phone rang. On the other end was her mother's worried voice. "Sandra, someone sent a letter to our house," her mother said, her voice trembling. "They said terrible things. They know where we live." Sandra gripped the phone tightly, feeling the blood rush to her temples. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll handle it," she reassured her, though anger churned inside her. Later that afternoon, Sandra received an anonymous email with a chilling message. "If you don't back down, we won't stop at words." The situation escalated when a tabloid article appeared, revealing personal information about Sandra, including her home address and details about her family relationships. The article also included baseless accusations, claiming she had abused her authority in the past to climb to her current position. The threats didn't stop at Sandra. They extended to her family. Neighbors reported seeing strangers loitering near her mother's home, causing unease and fear in the neighborhood. Each passing day brought mounting pressure, but Sandra refused to falter. In her most stressful moments, she focused on her larger goal, exposing the truth and defending her integrity. She convened a private meeting with her trusted allies, including Darren Wilson and now Jake Miller. "Robert's playing dirty," she said, her gaze resolute. "He thinks he can scare me, but this only proves who he truly is." Jake, once a pawn of Robert's, couldn't hide his unease. "I knew he was capable of things like this, but I didn't think he'd go this far," he admitted, his tone laced with guilt. "We need to act fast," Darren interjected. "What Robert is doing is personal, but it also shows he's scared. If we can bring these threats to light, it'll weaken his position." Sandra agreed. She decided to use these threats to strengthen her case before the council. She would not only demonstrate that the system was corrupt, but also reveal that Robert was willing to cross any boundary to protect his power. Robert's counterattack wasn't just about self-preservation. It was a personal assault on Sandra, highlighting the animosity between them. Yet, instead of retreating, Sandra turned the threats into her weapon, solidifying her resolve in the fight for justice. Robert could play dirty, but Sandra knew that the truth and her unwavering determination were her greatest weapons in this battle. Robert Haynes's insidious counterattacks did not deter Sandra Taylor. Instead, they drove her to prepare more meticulously for the next hearing, a pivotal moment where everything would be brought to light. With new evidence, Jake Miller's unexpected role as a witness, and Sandra's unshakable resolve, the hearing promised to be the turning point in the battle. The day of the hearing arrived, and the meeting room was packed with council members, police officers, and even members of the press. A tense atmosphere filled the air as Sandra entered, with Jake Miller walking quietly behind her. The council began by reviewing the evidence Sandra had submitted. Each document, every leaked email, painted a clear picture of how Robert Haynes had concealed Jake's misconduct and that of other allies within the department. After Sandra's presentation, the council called Jake to testify. The room fell silent as Jake stepped up to the podium, all eyes on him, some skeptical, others contemptuous. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes wavering between anxiety and determination. "I used to believe this system protected us," he began, his voice low but steady. "But I was wrong. It doesn't protect us. It protects those who exploit it to maintain their power." He paused, looking directly at the council. "It took me a long time to realize this. Every time Robert praised me, I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I see that I wasn't just harming the community, I was harming myself." He stopped for a moment, his voice growing more emotional. "I've seen the fear in the eyes of the people we swore to protect. I've heard their pleas, and I ignored them. But today, I can't continue to do that." Jake recounted closed-door meetings with Robert, where decisions to cover up misconduct were made. He detailed how Robert instructed the alteration of reports, ignored community complaints, and manipulated internal processes to ensure his loyalists were never held accountable. "Robert didn't just protect me," Jake said, his voice cracking with regret. "He created a system where the truth had no place, and I was part of that system." Jake's testimony left the room holding its breath. Some council members looked down at the documents before them, visibly uncomfortable. But Sandra knew this wasn't yet the decisive blow. When her turn came, Sandra stood, her gaze sweeping across the room, her words carrying the weight of truth and unwavering determination. "You've heard everything," she began, her voice calm but powerful. "These pieces of evidence, these testimonies, are not just about Robert Haynes or Jake Miller. They are about a system that has allowed injustice and corruption to thrive for years." Sandra walked slowly across the room, her eyes locking onto each council member. "If you do not act, you're not merely ignoring the truth. You're complicit in perpetuating injustice. You're saying that this system, with all its rot, is worth protecting instead of changing." She paused, her voice taking on an emotional edge. "But remember, the people we serve are not this system. They are the community out there, the people who trust us to protect them, not abuse them." The room was silent, save for the scratch of pens as council members took notes. But Sandra didn't stop. "I stand here today not for myself, but for the values we have sworn to uphold. I am not asking you to do what is easy. I'm asking you to do what is right." As Sandra sat down, the room remained hushed. Robert, seated at the back, looked visibly uneasy, but he had no rebuttal. Sandra's words had left a lasting impact. The council announced that it would need time to deliberate, but Sandra knew she had gained the support of some. Even the previously hesitant members could no longer ignore the evidence and the power of her challenge. This decisive hearing marked a significant turning point in Sandra's battle. With Jake's unexpected cooperation and her impassioned speech, she had shaken the foundations of Robert Haynes's protective system. But would the council have the courage to act, or would it all amount to a hollow performance of justice? The answer was still waiting ahead. The hearing had just concluded, but its reverberations echoed throughout the Eastbridge Police Department. The evidence Sandra Taylor presented, combined with Jake Miller's testimony, left a profound impact. But Sandra knew it wasn't enough to take down Robert Haynes entirely. She needed a decisive blow, irrefutable evidence. And then, like a beam of light piercing the darkness, the opportunity arrived. 2 days after the hearing, Darren Wilson knocked on Sandra's office door, a small USB drive in his hand. "You need to see this immediately," Darren said urgently. Sandra plugged the USB into her computer, her eyes widening as an old video from years prior began to play. In the video, Robert Haynes, then a senior officer, was seated in a private meeting room. His voice was crystal clear. "Take that part out of the report. We don't need this causing more trouble. Make sure no one outside this room finds out." The video continued, showing Robert explicitly instructing his allies to cover up a severe incident of excessive force that had resulted in the death of a young suspect. Sandra held her breath, her heart pounding. This was the evidence she needed. The video didn't just expose Robert's true nature. It revealed how he wielded his power to bury wrongdoing. "Where did this come from?" Sandra asked Darren, her voice low but sharp. "It came from an anonymous source," Darren replied. "They said it's part of the records lost during the investigation from back then." Sandra clenched her fists. She knew this video would leave the council with no choice but to act against Robert. At the final hearing, Sandra walked into the room with quiet confidence, the USB tucked securely in her pocket. The tension in the room was palpable as the council began the session. When it was her turn to present, Sandra rose, her gaze steady as it swept over the council members. "I have new evidence to present," she announced, pulling out the USB. "This is a video from years ago that shows Deputy Chief Robert Haynes deliberately covering up a serious incident, violating every principle we are sworn to uphold." Before the video could play, Robert abruptly stood, demanding the council halt the hearing. "I object to the use of this video," he said angrily. "There's no guarantee it hasn't been tampered with or taken out of context." One council member pressed Robert for further explanation, but he evaded the question, his eyes flicking briefly to a subordinate sitting at the back of the room, who then suddenly left without a word. When the video played, Robert's expression shifted dramatically, from confident to panicked. The council immediately began questioning whether other critical documents had also been concealed. Officers who had remained silent throughout the investigation now started to speak up, further destabilizing Robert's defense. The room fell into a stunned silence as the video played on the large screen. Robert's voice rang out, unmistakable and damning. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting between shock and outrage. Robert, seated at the back of the room, sat red-faced and silent, unable to refute the evidence. His words on the video were indisputable. When the video ended, Sandra turned to face the council. "This isn't just about one individual," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "This is about a system that has rotted from the inside. A system where people like Robert Haynes use their power to protect themselves instead of serving justice." The council convened for a private session immediately after, and their decision came within an hour. Robert Haynes was suspended effective immediately, along with several of his closest allies. A complete overhaul of the police department was approved, including new transparency and accountability measures. As the decision was read aloud, small rounds of applause broke out from some officers in the room. Sandra sat quietly, her eyes reflecting both relief and exhaustion. Jake, seated in the back row, approached her as others began to file out. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with respect. "It wasn't me," Sandra replied. "It was the truth that did it." With irrefutable evidence, Sandra had achieved the greatest victory of her career, but she knew this was only the beginning. Reform would take time and persistence, but today she had proven that justice could prevail, even in the most corrupt systems. In a shadowed corner of the police department, Robert Haynes quietly exited, bearing the heaviest defeat of his life. But would he truly give up, or would he seek revenge? That answer remained to be seen. The council's decision marked a significant turning point, but Sandra Taylor knew the real work was just beginning. The downfall of Robert Haynes and his allies wasn't the end. It was an opportunity to reform a system that had rotted from within. As sunlight streamed through her office window the next morning, Sandra sat at her desk drafting a comprehensive reform plan, one she knew would fundamentally change the way the Eastbridge Police Department operated. Sandra began by introducing a new training program for the entire police force. The program focused on building communication skills, conflict management, and community-oriented thinking instead of reliance on authoritarian power. "This isn't just about following the rules," she said during a meeting with the remaining senior officers. "It's about truly serving and protecting the community, as we swore to do." Additionally, Sandra implemented unprecedented transparency policies. All reports concerning officer misconduct would be partially made public, allowing the community to hold the department accountable. She also invited community leaders to join an advisory committee, ensuring residents' voices would be heard in critical decisions. The first meeting with the advisory committee took place in a small room, where community leaders from diverse backgrounds sat across from Sandra. They brought concerns and questions, but also a glimmer of hope. "People here don't need promises," said a young leader. "They need action." Sandra nodded, her gaze steady. "And you will help me ensure that happens," she replied. Though skepticism remained, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. It was the beginning not only of reform, but also of rebuilding trust, a trust that had been fractured for years. While Sandra focused on rebuilding the police department, Jake Miller left Eastbridge, carrying the weight of his past mistakes. He knew he no longer had a place in the law enforcement and couldn't return to his old life. Jake moved to a small town outside the city, where no one knew him or his past. There, he found work at a nonprofit organization supporting at-risk youth, children whose lives were vulnerable to violence, poverty, or a lack of proper guidance. One afternoon, in the nonprofit's modest classroom, Jake stood before a group of teenagers. He shared his story, hiding nothing, from the mistakes he had made to the painful lessons he had learned. "You have a choice," Jake said, his voice low but sincere. "Don't let anyone tell you that you can't change. I made the wrong choices and I paid the price, but you can do better." Jake's words, though simple, left a profound impact. He was no longer the hardened cop he once was, but a man trying to atone for his mistakes, one step at a time. Back in Eastbridge, Sandra began to see the first signs of change. Young officers showed enthusiasm for the new training program, while some residents expressed feeling safer with the advisory committee in place. One evening, as Sandra was leaving the department, an elderly resident stopped her on the street. "You're doing good work," he said, his eyes filled with hope. "Don't give up." Sandra smiled. "Thank you. I won't." Both Sandra and Jake embarked on new journeys, one to rebuild trust and justice within the system, the other to atone for his past by helping the next generation. Though their paths diverged, they carried the same vital lesson. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And sometimes even those who have lost their way can find the road back. The reforms implemented by Sandra Taylor began to show results. Little by little, the Eastbridge Police Department started to transform. The atmosphere within the department became more positive. Officers began to trust in a transparent and fair system. And, most importantly, the community's faith in law enforcement was being restored. Sandra wasn't just a leader. She became a symbol, a figure of integrity and resilience, proving that even the most corrupted systems could change if someone was brave enough to stand against them. At a small ceremony held at the local community center, Sandra was invited to speak before a gathering of residents. The room was filled with familiar faces, from young officers in the department to citizens who had once lost faith in the system. Change is never easy, Sandra began, her warm voice resonating through the room. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Every small step, every right decision we make, contributes to a greater difference. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I'm not the only one here who has done the right thing. It's all of you who believed in change that have helped us reach this point today. And I know there is still much work ahead. But today, I feel prouder than ever of this community. Applause erupted throughout the room. To those present, Sandra wasn't just a police chief. She was a beacon of hope, a living testament that truth and courage could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Hundreds of miles away, Jake Miller stepped out of the Youth Support Center, his eyes following the children as they left after a long day. He smiled faintly when one boy turned back to wave at him. "Thanks, Jake," the boy called out. Those simple words carried immense meaning for Jake. He knew he couldn't undo his past, but he also understood that his future could now be shaped by positive actions. That evening, in his small room, Jake sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Sandra. In it, he said, "Sandra, thank you for not giving up on me, even though I once did the unforgivable. You gave me a chance to face my mistakes, and I hope that what I'm doing now can, in some way, make amends. I will never forget what happened, and I will keep trying to be a better person." The story closed with Sandra sitting in her office, sunlight streaming through the window, reflecting off a plaque that read, "To serve and protect." Sandra closed her eyes, reflecting on the difficult moments that had brought her here. She knew that not everyone could do what Jake had done, face their mistakes and strive to make things right. But she also believed that, with enough courage, everyone deserved a second chance. To the audience, this story wasn't just about Sandra or Jake. It was a reminder. Do you have the courage to stand up like Sandra, to confront injustice and change the system? And do you believe that people like Jake deserve a chance to redeem themselves? The story of Sandra and Jake was not just a personal journey, but a symbol of bravery, determination, and the power of transformation. It left behind a powerful message. Anyone can make a difference if they are willing to face the truth and act for what is right. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for joining us.